What's up, everyone? This is Ghost for Yang, and today is the first in a series of reviews I'll be creating where I dive into the books written by the prominent candidates in the race for the presidency. The inspiration for this came to me recently when I realized just how much Yang content I consume. The Joe Rogan podcast led me to Yang's book, The War on Normal People, and what's remarkable about the Yang Gang is just how well versed we are in our candidates' policy and personal history. But like many of you, I noticed that this started to become an echo chamber. My Twitter and YouTube feeds are dominated by Yang content, which can include attacks, both fair, not fair, and everything in between, on the other candidates running and their ideas. So one at a time, I'll be taking a dive into these candidates through their written words, in chief, their books. There are enough channels out there covering the current news cycle on behalf of Yang. Shout out to Paget KG, the Zach and Matt Show, and many others. So we're going to explore the background here. I'll be evaluating these books under the guise that they're in the author's own words. Of course, most if not all of these books used a co-writer or a ghostwriter, but the author has put them out as a representation of themselves, and I'll be treating them accordingly. Obviously, I'm a Yang supporter, and that will inevitably color my reaction to these texts, but I pledge that none of these will be designed as any kind of gotcha or political hit. I'm going to each one of these reviews with an open mind. So without further ado, our first book is Shortest Way Home by Pete Buttigieg, the young mayor of South Bend, Indiana, a prominent contender in the Democratic primary race who's often neck and neck with Yang in the polls. Yes, Pete annoyed me somewhat in the third debate, when he was dismissive of Yang's freedom dividend contest in his opening statement, and when he ironically interrupted Yang in the middle of the debate to call for, of all things, civility. But all in all, I've found him to be a sharp individual who's expressed some innovative ideas in the town halls and interviews I've seen with him so far. First takeaway from Shortest Way Home. This dude is smart. We all know about his aptitude for languages, his overachieving nature, his relentless motor for work, and his strong logic and reasoning. But beyond that, the dude knows how to roll his sleeves. He's so confident in his sleeve game, it's the cover of his book. Do you go flap first? Or do you start from the forearm? Do you keep the button buttoned? I'll be real with you. I always second guess my sleeve rolling. What's the right sleeve pattern for any situation? I'm envious, Pete. If you could put out a sleeve rolling tutorial, that would be huge. Do it, Pete. Help us out. Help me out. The second big takeaway, this is a surprise for me, there's a lot of talk in the book about the effects of technological progress and the collateral danger it causes. One of the first anecdotes Pete tells in Shortest Way Home is about the South Bend Watch Company, a prominent 19th century manufacturer of pocket watches that didn't quickly adapt to wristwatches when they became fashionable, and the resulting damage that this had on its employees and the community. Automation is all over this book, which makes sense given he comes from the Midwest and has had a close-up view of the communities Yang discusses at length. The book was published in January of 2019, with reviews first trickling in fall of 2018, after Yang had entered the race, but far before he had become a prominent candidate that pretty much anyone took seriously. So while recently it may seem like Pete has been stealing some of Yang's talking points, #repeat, it's important to remember that Yang doesn't own these viewpoints. Yang's made it his focus, but unless Pete starts stealing direct policies from Yang, we should be happy that another strong candidate in the race shares some of these perspectives. The book is a pretty straightforward autobiography, constructing a narrative where Pete picks up his political viewpoints as he matures. In high school, Pete wrote an essay praising Bernie Sanders, which was dug up by Republican candidates and opponents during his mayoral run. He volunteered for Al Gore in college, a section that alludes to a Let Ralph debate movement in 2000, referring to Ralph Nader of the Green Party. Yang Gang, we're not the first impassioned political groups to be fighting the media for our candidates' day in court. Pete's youth gives him a fresh perspective on the Bush years, in particular 9/11 and the War on Terror. He walks through a perfectly logical takedown of the motivations for the Iraq War. Effective while I read it, but in hindsight, nothing revolutionary. We get to his time at Harvard, where he laces his political stances against concepts like the philosophy of free will, as well as his practical method for decision making, one calculus decision at a time. Like I said, the dude's smart. Pete describes working a job where his motivation was poor and his work performance suffered, and hit on a whoa moment for me, both in terms of my own life and my thoughts on how Andrew Yang thinks about work. You see, Pete describes himself as a purpose-driven person, and concludes that, and I'm paraphrasing here, purpose-driven people must care about their work. If they don't care or don't learn to care about the task at hand, it's not the right task, career, or job for them. From a personal level, this really made me think. When I've been in jobs or working on projects that I believed in, I've had no problem pulling long shifts and all-nighters. This is how I've actually thought of volunteering for the Yang Gang. It's never felt like work because of my belief in the end game. This is a remarkable thing to consider as our economy transforms to the 21st century. A foundation of mental well-being for a person is being in the right role for them. This is another problem with Bernie Sanders' federal jobs guarantee. It's not just about placing human bodies objectively into roles. For us to improve our mental health as a society, we need to collectively align people, where possible, towards roles that they themselves will believe in. We get to 2008, where Pete describes knocking on doors for Obama. This is also where Pete's call to service starts to emerge. He observes that a severe lack of military at the Ivy League schools is a historical anomaly. Princeton was number one that year, 2008, with a whooping 9 soldiers amongst its class, when in generations past, the percentages were far higher. See, he's a numbers guy, just like Andrew. This keenly shows that the war on terror, for the most part, has been a severely compartmentalized war for America, overly drawing soldiers from impoverished lower and middle class demographics, and likely contributing to our cultural divide. As a young man, Pete makes a run for state treasurer of Indiana and starts to get the attention of some interests that I'll dub the powers that be. This is me editorializing, but there's an interesting way of looking at Pete's political career. He's an insanely driven, intelligent man who appears to possess a strong moral compass, and is naturally on the radar of some elder statesmen and party members. There's nothing wrong with this, but it does lead me to believe that there's an early selection here to steer Pete towards being a leader of the Democratic Party, a grooming, if you will. Fun fact from the book that I'd like to pass on: did you know that the fastest animal on Earth is a dive-bombing falcon capable of speeds of 200 miles an hour? Crazy. Pete sees them out the window from his mayor's office. That's why he mentions it in the book, and I just thought, that's a fast bird. Moving on, Pete is elected mayor of South Bend. At first, the ceremonial duties are irritating to him. This man is a workhorse after all, but he soon grows to recognize the importance of a mayor's role as a symbol. As a mayor, he is inhaling the spirit of his city. He also talks about navigating tricky agenda. A plan to extend Martin Luther King Street is met with protests that on the surface appear to be about economics, the cost for businesses of changing their addresses, but can't help but carry a tinge of racism. During his time as mayor, Pete is deployed to the Middle East, and there's a fascinating juxtaposition between his life as the mayor, where everyone reports to him, and his time in training and serving, where he's another fixture in the chain of command. Speaking of chain of command, I think we're in a military fly zone. Pete's also a pianist, of course he is, and finds himself playing a performance of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue while mayor. A little bit of history of the Rhapsody in Blue: Gershwin was up against a tight deadline and composed it in a matter of weeks. And this prompts from Pete a fun quote from conductor Leonard Bernstein: "Greatness requires 2 ingredients, a plan and not quite enough time." Pete's time as mayor teaches him the difference between reporting issues and resolving issues, another good takeaway both for one's personal life and management at large. It's here that we get a large section on data in the 21st century, how computer programming is changing our lives, and, get ready for it, self-driving cars. Holy cow. Is Pete Buttigieg Yang Gang? We then get an interesting dissection of his complex relationship with then-Governor Mike Pence. The two are initially friendly, and Pence seems to possess a real respect for Pete as a successful young mayor. But what later puts them at odds, rightfully so, is Pence's fixation on social issues, leading to his push for Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Pete says that this anti-LGBTQ legislation ironically made Pence, in a twisted fashion, the perfect VP for Trump, able to shore up his support from the hardline and conservative base. One thing that strikes me about the book is Pete's an only child. Everything about Pete from this book and how he conducts himself in the campaign trail seems to just reflect a man who never takes a false step. Good parenting here. Now there's a brief segment on the police chief scandal that has been a piece of concern about Pete's handling of racial issues in South Bend. In 2012, Pete demoted Police Chief Daryl Boykins, the city's first black police chief, following an investigation that revealed the department had improperly reported phone calls. This led to charges of discrimination against Pete, as the phone call recording was a practice his white predecessors had participated in. Pete came under pressure to release the tapes, but to do so would violate the Wiretap Act. My takeaway from how this plays out in the book is he was given a difficult decision that had far-reaching cultural and racial consequences. It appears as though Pete is always using that advanced calculus decision-making to take the right course of action, and he admits that he could have handled things differently and that it was his first serious mistake as mayor. I don't really have an opinion on it. On the one hand, you have a police chief engaging in a questionable practice, and on the other, you have a department that had a history of questionable practices, and you have a mayor looking to overhaul the system. We finally get to Pete's coming out and his relationship with Chasten, who's now his husband. While reading this book, I frequently forgot about Pete's youth, but not here. Pete and Chasten met on a dating app. Just let that sink in. If Pete is elected president, we'll not only have our first openly gay president, Lincoln, and not only have our first dude, but the nation's first couple will have met on Hinge. Who feels old? What shouldn't be too surprising, given Pete's bio, is just how straightforward and vanilla his relationship with Chasten appears to be. With the exception of their online meeting, everything about their courtship feels like a throwback to a nostalgic relationship in the 50s. I'm recording this the day after Saturday Night Live made a joke about Pete being, quote, not gay enough. And hey, come on everyone, that doesn't exist. Pete's a focused, workaholic, driven individual, and the love he has with Chasten seems to fit absolutely perfectly. The final segments of the book chronicle Pete running for chair of the Democratic National Committee in 2017. Ironically, he gets a call from Bernie Sanders, who encourages him to drop out in favor of Keith Ellison. Tom Perez ultimately won. Come on, Bernie. Pete wrote a high school essay for you. He also describes the first few weeks of Trump's presidency, where he and his colleagues were planning long-term ways to resist the president when they realized that the Muslim ban has led to immediate protests at airports. As they race to join the protests, Pete reflects that it will be essential for leaders like him to speed up their ability to respond to the world's pace in real time. While the DNC establishment was busy brainstorming long-term plans, spur-of-the-moment grassroots protests at airports were making all the difference. He closes on a call to action for people to get involved in their local politics, and in a fashion similar to both Yang and JFK, really does appear to be looking forward on how we can transform as a people for the future. So what to make of this? First, my respect for Pete Buttigieg has grown immensely. We take for granted just how accomplished this individual is at such a young age. Second, Pete is a true politician. Part of what's refreshing about Andrew Yang is that he is specifically a true outsider. The same was true of Ross Perot, Herman Cain, and admit it, Ben Carson and Donald Trump. Pete's youth makes him relatively untouched by not just the establishment's interest, but also the grooved ways of thinking that often set in as officials' careers move forward. But he is, objectively speaking, a political mastermind through and through, a true people's servant and with a strong moral code for service, sacrifice, and work ethic. So what we really have here is someone worth paying attention to. My support is still 100% behind Yang, but it was a joy to get to know Pete Buttigieg's history and perspectives. I encourage everyone, Yang gang or not, to take this man seriously, engage civilly and enthusiastically with his supporters. Just imagine a scenario where Yang and Buttigieg, in some capacity, work together to move this country forward. Thanks to everyone for listening to this inaugural video of the Ghost for Yang channel. The next review will be up soon. Like, comment, subscribe, and all that jazz. And most importantly, vote. Make a plan to vote. Tell your friends to vote. Tell your family to vote. The single greatest threat to our country is a non-representative government, and the only way we prevent that is by participating in our democracy. And if those votes just happen to be for Andrew Yang,